Greetings everyone, one and all, welcome once more. As always, I am your most humble host, Jay. I return once more from the void between pages to again tell of the bizarre and the unknown. So sit and relax as I again share with you what I've been reading. This time, we're starting off with something a little bit different, as this time we're moving beyond the wondrous world of American comics and setting sail for the shores of European ones, with a French comic called Kairos. Kairos, also known as Kairos Integral, was a 3-issue comic written and illustrated by Ulysses Malasagne, released over the course of 2013 to 2015 and published by Ankama Studios. Which was actually a surprise to me, as I didn't know that they did printed media before now. I figured they were strictly an animation studio. The series was later picked up for an American release by First Second, translated by Ann and Owen Smith, and released in mid-2020. The story revolves around a young man named Nils, who goes on a trip with his girlfriend and/or fiancée, Anaël, to a little cabin in the woods to get away from their troubles and relax for a while. However, things go wrong when a squadron of lizard people appear from nowhere, kidnapping Anaël and dragging her off to parts unknown. Nil manages to get dragged along to a mysterious other world and sets off on a journey to rescue his love from whatever fate she has in store. Sounds like a story you've heard dozens of times before, right? Well, don't speak too soon. Now this one is a bit difficult to discuss without bringing up key moments from the story, so there's going to be a blanket level spoiler warning. If you're interested in hearing my thoughts, but want to read the story yourself, I've left a timecode in the description to skip to if you wish. Otherwise, on with the show. As I alluded to, the story isn't an ordinary fantasy tale, and serves to deconstruct some of the typical hallmarks of the genre, the brave warrior rescuing the damsel in distress, and the fairy tale romances that come with it. The story front-loads this to a degree, with Nils coming off fairly clingy and a tad obsessive by trying to meticulously plot out their lives together, and Anaël being really bitchy and more focused on her own needs than listening to what Nils has to think. And to a degree, this does a good job at establishing their relationship. You get the feeling that they do both genuinely love each other, but that they're trying desperately to make it work beyond any reasonable doubt. But the story doesn't utilize it to its fullest, as we don't get much insight into what their lives were like prior to arriving at the cabin. We're left in the dark about either of their real feelings, or how much of their relationship is fake or not. Anaël is also barely in the story after her capture, and there's only a handful of pages with her in the rest of the story, so we never get much insight into her state of mind other than her objecting to her imprisonment. Nils' growing obsession with rescuing Anaël and casual, open disregard for the land he's in and how it functions is visually well represented, having him slowly transform more and more into a dragon form as the story goes along and as his anger grows, and works as a good metaphor for his loss of humanity. But the dialogue doesn't let the art do its work, and oftentimes over-explains what we're shown, which not only insults the reader, but also makes the expected end to the story much more obvious. And it is a shame, since the transformation is done well. It occurs gradually over the story, and still retains Nils' general shape and features, so he still physically resembles his human self even by the end when he's a hulking monstrous dragon. His frenzied rush to rescue Anaël is very fast-paced, leading to incredibly fluid and dynamic action, and is thoroughly engaging to watch as Nils speeds through everything in his path on his quest. However, this leaves the story feeling fairly sparse, and it's not given enough time to fully develop. While I wouldn't say there are gaps in the story, the central dilemma within the world is established well and explained enough for the audience to follow along, it also doesn't flesh out the setting enough or give the story time to reflect on itself, introducing an element then immediately jumping into an action scene to rush the story along. The monarchy is crumbling and the people are angered, seeing the king as a corrupt monster who brought his people to ruin, and their desperation to see the recently returned princess to ascend to the throne. Meanwhile, a rebellion is brewing and plotting to prematurely end the monarchy before the princess can take power. All of this is introduced in fairly short dialogues, which immediately segue into intense action scenes as Nils plows through soldiers on his quest to save Anaël. And narratively, it makes sense that the story doesn't linger on these, as Nils doesn't have any interest in the situation, simply wanting to get things over with and rescue Anaël. Nils doesn't care about the kingdom, he doesn't care about the monarchy or the oncoming revolution, and certainly wants no part in it, despite him accidentally kicking the revolution into open combat with the monarchy, while openly decrying his portrayal as a messianic figure, a noble knight who arrives to lead the revolution and free the people being something he wants no part in. However, as a reader, this doesn't really work out, since while the characters might have no interest in the events going on, we're still left to read it and parse what's going on. So dumping information, then immediately moving on to something new at a breakneck pace creates a weird feeling with the story. It's not inherently a bad thing, mind you. If done well, it would have helped convey the intended message of the story, but the intended meaning behind it is somewhat lost in the execution. The overarching plot with Anna El is that she is, in fact, the long-lost princess that the kingdom has been waiting for all this time, abandoning her home in protest to her royal obligations. This isn't treated as much as a twist, as we, the audience, get told this by the end of the first issue. Not that it wouldn't still be obvious considering it's one of the oldest tropes in the genre. Revealing it outright early on is an interesting decision narratively, as it intends to show the audience that Anna El is in no real danger and Nils is causing havoc over nothing. However, this falls apart pretty quickly when we find out that the royal obligation and ancient tradition she ran away from was that the king, her father, was going to marry and impregnate her to keep their bloodline going. On a moral level, it's impossible for the audience to not support Nils' crusade at this point because the alternative is just so objectionable. It's not even something the characters in the setting agree with, as Anna El openly objects and refuses the idea, her servants object to it, and the citizens in the kingdom clearly find it a bad idea and are only willing to support it because they hope Anna El is better than the king. At no point does the story give any good reason for why we're not supposed to be against this, as Anna El's mother repeatedly tries to justify it, but her only argument for doing so is that it's necessary for the royal family's power to keep going, later explained as being a hereditary ability to control other dragons, which is pretty much the reason why everything has gone to shit in the setting to begin with, and why there's an active revolution in the works. The monarchy and the kingdom are painted in a wholly negative light, shown as corrupt and uncaring, having led the kingdom to dozens of wars, crashing the economy and effectively leaving their people to rot. This makes it especially hard to see them in any positive light, nor does it make you want to sympathize with them once the revolution comes knocking and the royal family starts dropping one by one. The fights between Nils and the royal family are fast and energetic. There's a great flow of motion between panels, and Melisania is able to convey a chaotic pace for the scenes and packs a lot of flashy choreography into them without making them overbearing or irritating to the senses. The violence also gets increasingly ramped up too, as earlier it was fairly bloodless and standard action fare, even when somebody gets killed, but as the final issue goes on, the fights get more intense and the gore amps up and up, culminating in a duel with the king, with Nils having nearly fully succumbed to his rage and near completely transformed into a dragon, as the two take part in a frenzied clash, all capped off with Nils beheading the king in full view of everyone. This is of course meant to be the big moment where the curtains are pulled back and we're clued in on what's really going on. The big surprise that's meant to put the whole story into a new context. Anna El didn't want to be rescued. Nils has lost himself in his rage and horrified everyone around him, and Nils is forced to return home, having lost his beloved Anna El due to the consequences of his actions. Except, it doesn't quite work out the way that's intended. For starters, the story's already made it exceedingly clear that this was going to happen, so the shock fails at impact because it's expected. It doesn't help that we then have the moral of the story literally explained to both Nils and the audience, as if we couldn't figure it out on our own. But the more important feeling of the story is that Nils really hasn't done anything wrong up to this point. Now let's be fair here. Murdering your girlfriend's family is generally considered to be a faux pas in most cultures, sure. But Anna El scolds Nils for not considering the weight of his actions and their consequences, nor for thinking about his situation at all. Except, by all accounts, he did. Nils saw his girlfriend get carted off by monsters to a hostile alien world for God only knows what reason, and is clearly not welcome by the kidnappers, and that's really all the motivation he needs. Even if he paid attention to what people were saying by recognizing her kidnappers as the royal guard, or putting two and two together in regards to his girlfriend being the long-lost princess, that doesn't really change his motives in any significant way. In fact, I'm sure that if he was told that his girlfriend was about to be forced into an incestuous marriage with her father, that would be even more of an incentive to go save her. Making this worse is how the royal family is depicted throughout the story, as there's very little positive elements shown of them, which, as mentioned, makes it hard to feel bad about them getting killed off. While yes, you could argue that Nils killing them was too far from an outside perspective, both Anna El's brother and mother were actively, openly trying to murder him from start to finish, so their deaths are mostly in self-defense and at least get a pass there. The king's death is a bit more subjective in this regard, as from his context, he was trying to protect his daughter from a rampaging monster, and even in a better context, Anna L seeing her dad get beheaded wouldn't be the nicest visual. But most people I asked for input were pretty gung-ho for seeing the guy trying to fuck and marry his own child to get killed, so you judge for yourself there. Putting all of that aside, the general state of the kingdom that we see doesn't paint the happiest picture. The king is despised, and there's a revolution actively plotting his downfall long before Nils ever arrived. So even if he never got involved, this outcome was pretty much inevitable. While Anna L stands her ground against her father's goals and promises to avoid his failings, you get the feeling that the king doesn't seem that swayed by her words. To that end, it's safe to assume very little would change without Nils being involved. The revolution would still be oncoming, and that one way or the other, regicide would still be on the menu. Nils simply sped things along, and we don't really get much of an idea how much better or worse things ended up because of his involvement. Which makes the moral feel somewhat disconnected from the story, as Nils is ultimately punished for events that would have occurred regardless of his involvement and, arguably, turned out for the better because of his involvement. Anna L's words also don't have much weight, as it's ultimately more about how she feels about Nils and not how his actions would impact the world around her, making her come off unnecessarily bitchy and a bit self-centered. While the moral isn't completely spoiled because of all this, it's still understandable, but it makes it very weak and is almost disconnected from what happens. Now, if there's one big positive element the story has, it's that Melisandre's art is absolutely gorgeous, and is the biggest highlight of the book for me. The loose, uneven line work and relatively simplistic designs of the characters gives it a very storybook feeling, and there seems to be a lot of influence drawn from the styles of Miyazaki with the environmental designs and the structure of set pieces. The hand-sketched and watercolor-painted look is very unique, and even the tiniest of details manage to pop out, enhancing the scene and attracting the eye without being distracting to look at. As mentioned, Melisandre has a wonderful eye for panel layout and can keep the flow going at a breakneck pace from page to page without it feeling like there's scenes missing. It leads to a very energetic story and lends itself well to the frenzied journey Nils goes on, and even the slower scenes still manage to keep a consistent pace going, although the story itself is rushing itself along. That it was more or less done entirely by himself is certainly impressive, and it's a good source of inspiration for other artists. Overall, while Kairos is a visually impressive work, the overall middling story makes it a hard sell. It has some breathtaking set pieces and a brilliant flow of motion, but the narrative is constantly at odds with it, sabotaging the story with a strange giddiness. Melisandre seems like he was so laser-focused on the big swerve ending and moral lesson that he couldn't seem to figure out how to make all the pieces connect. A subversive story that plays with your expectations is not an inherently bad thing, but when the writer sets out to make a story that's inherently meant to subvert the expected story progression, more often than not they forget to fill the rest of the story with anything of merit to make the subversion worth the time and effort. As well, the action set pieces eat into what should be space to flesh out these story moments, and while I wouldn't suggest to trim them down, I also would say that it needed more time to breathe. I feel like the story would have worked better fully animated, either as a full movie or an animated short, as it would have allowed the action scenes to retain their fluid pace and frantic motion without sacrificing their length, as well as to allow for the slower moments to be further fleshed out and pace everything out further, making the story feel more natural and giving it a chance to better set up the twist. Interestingly, there was an animated version made as a short teaser trailer to promote the comic, produced by Studio La Cache, the animation studio behind Primal, which incidentally Melisandre works at, and it shows just how seamlessly the story works in motion without sacrificing any of the content. And not only is it utterly gorgeous, but the pacing of events feels more natural as well. If you're looking for artistic inspiration, then give it a look. The book provides lots of great visuals that can serve as wonderful reference material, but otherwise, there isn't much substance to get out of it. Up next, we have Electric Warrior. It seems like the sci-fi dystopia genre is a dime a dozen these days. You can't go 2 feet without tripping over at least a dozen half-baked cyberpunk clones or someone wanting to be the next Blade Runner without putting in any effort to make it work. It's a genre that pretty much has every possible permutation covered by now. Our current topic is, unsurprisingly, not an exception. Electric Warrior was an 18-issue series published by, you guessed it, DC Comics, written by the legendary Doug Moench with Jim Baikie on art. It's your pretty typical sci-fi dystopia. The uber-rich live in massive, sprawling city-states built high in the skylines, while the ground level play host to the Warrens, deadly fetid slums and the crumbling supports of the majestic palaces in the sky, populated by barely sapient Zigs who feed on the scraps of high society. Those who seek to flee from the technological nightmare the world has become are forced to struggle with polluted wilderness and the mutants who occupy them. The cities are policed by the eponymous Electric Warriors, cybernetic peacekeepers who single-mindedly enforce the whims of the elite, usually translating to murdering the pathetic slum-dwelling scum. Pretty basic, all things considered. This time, we're focusing on the first 9 issues of the series, cover dated from May of 1986 to January of 1987. The book is separated into 2 distinct plot lines, running concurrently with each other. While the 2 plot lines don't directly connect with each other up until the last issue of this batch, the events of one tend to have an effect on the other, but typically not directly so. The A plot of the series focuses on Electric Warrior designate Model Number 9-03, who due to an unknown aberrance has found himself freed from the cybernetic control net of his fellow warriors, becoming self-aware and developing his own sense of right and wrong, striking out against his former masters and becoming a champion for the Ziggs as he learns what it means to truly be human. The B plot focuses on Derek Two-Shadow, a child of the Warrens who managed to escape the nightmares of the city with his mind intact, living in the heart of nature with those who rejected the technologies the city provided, as he's forced to confront his past life and struggle to maintain his place when a researcher from the big city comes to document Derek and his fellow primitives. The comic does a good job at establishing the setting relatively early. As shallow as it is, it does feel like Moek and Baiki put plenty of thought into how everything fits together. There's not much in the way of nonsense future science technobabble or incomprehensible slang, which I'm fine with as it never really goes over well. The exception are the Ziggs, who speak in a very erratic and convoluted dialect packed with simplistic metaphors to refer to things, which is less slang and more illiteracy. It's not exactly impossible to understand. Moek, of course, has plenty of experience writing crazy people, but it can be a bit difficult to parse what's being said when there's no one normal to translate it. I personally didn't have much trouble other than a few early bits, but I know how to speak schizo, so your mileage may vary. There's a distinct parallel and thematic overlap between Nine and Derek, both beings hailing from one life being thrust into another alien life. The viewpoint is reversed between the two, with Nine experiencing this shift as the story goes on and having to deal with the impact of his actions, and Derek having put his past behind him and having acclimated to his new environment, only for new developments to draw the lingering temptations of his past life back from the abyss to haunt him. Nine is a fairly interesting take on the usual machine becomes self-aware story, as it's actually a relatively benign shift. It's slowly built to over the course of the first 2 issues, and there's no big surprise event that occurs that immediately turns him over. It's little things that call his attention and shift his perspective that leads to his eventual abandonment of his role as enforcer. I also like that we never get any real insight into what led him to developing free will. Several characters, and Nine himself, speculate on what exactly caused it, and no conclusive answer is given as to why, at least in the batch I read. For all everyone knows, Nine just spontaneously broke free of the netmind by sheer coincidence, and that any other of the Lex could do the same, but this isn't explored all that much. Which I'm fine with. Self-awareness pity parties are overdone, and I more enjoy the direction of Nine trying to adapt to his newly found moral code and changing his outlook. What I also found intriguing was the way Nine's change comes about, based on the influence of an elderly woman named Kinsolving, as well as 2 Ziggs who end up trying to take advantage of Nine, which shifts into him seeking to become a benefactor and guardian for the people of the slums. I find it interesting how even with his free will and ability to determine his own actions, his choices aren't his own 100%, and he's influenced by others to take them, be it directly by convincing him to help wreak havoc against the elites, or indirectly with Kinsolving's moral quandaries serving to pop Nine's facade and discover his own nature. I found the 2 sides of the dilemma curious, and I thought it was a neat angle. And it was equally fascinating as by the time I had put the connection together myself, the book directly refers to this by having the dueling hypocrisies called attention to, which was very well handled. But there's this subplot about Nine falling in love with Kinsolving that feels rather strange to me and a bit forced. It doesn't really come from anywhere, and it feels at odds with how their relationship with each other had been developed up to now. And it comes off like manufactured pathos to try and push the plot ahead. With a minor change it could work well, make it less obviously romantic love, and more a familial thing, it would be a little less jarring and fit with the relationship the 2 had up to that point. Derek takes a while to get interesting for me though. While I like his aloof demeanor, he works better later on once he becomes a foil for the rest of his primy friends and their inflexibility. He spends most of the early issues debating with Quintana, the researcher from the city who's come to document the primitives and their ways. I like the route it goes with her trying to poke holes in Derek and his people's beliefs, but her arguments aren't worded very well, so she comes off as that one guy who goes, "You engage with society, therefore you can't criticize it, ha ha," but about technology. but I do like how neither side is shown as inherently better. The pros and cons are raised for each side, even if they're not well represented. Derek's plotline becoming about battling the temptations of his past life coming back to cloud his ideals, as well as his growing alienation from his people, is more interesting though, and I think utilizes his character better. His dual nature allows him to be more pragmatic and able to be critical of his own ideologies in a way the others can't, leading to ostracization from his peers, in turn slowly driving him back to where he once was in the process. Derek's quiet indignation over his treatment is a nice surprise. It feels more interesting that way, and that it makes Derek seem like the bigger man, without making his fellow primies feel like strawmen. As mentioned, the two plot lines with our protagonists are supplemented by an overarching narrative, the events of which influence the individual plots of the heroes, which in turn affect the narrative, as well as influence the other's storyline. The central storyline revolves around the machinations of the city's leader, Magistrate Martyr, who discovers something threatening the Earth and all life on it, forcing him to enact a secret program to construct a new breed of warriors to save the planet. Unfortunately for everyone involved, this means human subjects. Now, exactly what Set Thread isn't told to us, at least in this batch of issues. Martyr keeps it as vague and secretive as possible, and other than it's something up in space, we get no clue into what's happening. Derek at one point says that it's the sun burning out, but within the context of the scene he's told this to lead him to a trap. I can't say for sure that's what it is. But Martyr's plan is to create an army of synthoids, fusing the electric warrior tech with human bodies to create more powerful and intelligent warriors is at least a good step in making the story feel a little more unique. The dueling storylines are balanced well, neither one gets more attention than the other. Early on I enjoyed Nine's story more, but around midway when Martyr enacts his plan to capture the premies, Derek's becomes more interesting. However, this seems to be by design, considering what happens by the end of this batch. Martyr is a good antagonist, as he's actually not a terrible guy, at least so far as we see of him. He fully understands how immoral his actions are, and feels guilty for having to go through with it, reluctantly ordering the capture of the primitives in order to save the world from impending doom, and is forced to shoulder the guilt over his actions. He never actively gloats over his actions or has any hidden agenda beyond stopping the incoming threat, and this makes him fairly interesting as it gives him some layers of well-intended meaning behind his extremism, and elevates him beyond being a generic cyberpunk city-state ruler villain. The most evil things he does personally are betraying both Nine and Derek, leading them into both into traps to force them to cooperate with his plan, which is only inherently evil because he's doing it to the protagonists. The batch of issues ends off in a pretty surprising cliffhanger, promising itself as the real first issue. It changes the dynamic of the series drastically, and the new direction looks to be very exciting. Nine is killed, betrayed by Martyr and Quintana, and torn to scrap for spare parts, trying to replicate the conditions that gave him free will. Derek is similarly betrayed, tricked into volunteering for the Synthoid project, and we're treated to a full issue's worth of Derek being systematically torn to pieces by scientists, slowly stripped of every tiny thing that made him human, enhanced by Nine's disassembled remains to become the first of the Synthoid warriors. Thanks to Quintana's interference, however, Derek retains his free will, busting free and becoming a powerful rogue agent in the process. The entire sequence is great. Baiki spares no detail with the horrifying process of being slowly skinned alive and broken down part by part. Moenk's writing as well, detailing Derek's thought process, is equally harrowing. It's very poetic and would work perfectly well on its own describing what happens, even without the art to back it up, although it does get a bit too verbose near the end of the issue. Derek's new armor is well designed as well. It's bulky but still identifiably human, and I like the cobbled together look he has, combining Nine's old body with new parts. The helmet being evocative of Nine's, with the single exposed eye and windowed brain pan, is my favorite part. It's genuinely terrifying and helps to accentuate the nightmare of man and machine Derek has become. The color scheme is a bit peculiar though. In terms of the color palette, teal, green, and purple with red accents works in theory, and is arranged in an aesthetically pleasing way, but it doesn't quite work with the design itself. It feels a bit too garish for this grim, transhumanist warrior to be decked out like a pride parade, but at the same time, I wouldn't say it ruins the design for me. The cover of the issue hasn't been full black with red, and it works better, but I haven't looked at any of the later issues to see if they change it or not. Overall, while Electric Warrior doesn't bring much new to the genre, or push the envelope with the story it's trying to tell, it's a suitably entertaining story that does what it does well. The major characters are well fleshed out in their motives and personalities, but the setting is a bit too flat to fully explore it all, at least in this first chunk. The usual cyberpunk themes of oppression and the unending march of technology ruining the world are represented, but shallow in their use. The artwork is pretty good, impressively detailed, and I like the switch between more rigid fixed line work used to show the elites of the city, and the broader, more erratic line work used for the slums and the premies. The action feels stiff though. There isn't a very good sense of motion from panel to panel, and it uses a lot of flat angles. The color palette again is a bit peculiar with muted tones but a wide array of colors, and is a bit disorienting at times. As well, the big city feels very lifeless both above and below. It's devoid of much detail, and there's very rarely, if ever, anyone in the backgrounds. And whether this is intentional or not, I couldn't say. Mowink's excellent prose ends up carrying a lot of the story. He has a very flowery and poetic way of describing what happens and packing a lot of meaning into a short sentence. And it helps to keep invested just seeing his descriptions of what goes on. I'll likely pick this up again in my own time, so I may come back to the series sometime soon. Personally though, I would say to check it out. It's a bit of a slow build until it really gets fun, but I think all the extra time spent establishing the characters helps you feel more invested by the midway point when the status quo shifts. It's not a slog to get through, but the jump in quality is very noticeable. But I feel like the series required it just to make the big swap have a big impact. And on that note, I believe that's all for this time. This has been Jay, and as I return to the void between pages, I look forward to when next we may meet, and I can share what else I've been reading.